All right. Welcome everybody to the 2023 5783 edition of the Friedhof Institute of Progressive Halakhah annual meeting. Our discussion today, the topic of our discussion is called "Is Nothing Sacred? Red Lines and Progressive Halakhah." I have with me on the screen members of the Friedhof Institute board, along with Rabbi Micah Streiffer, who is a member of the Friedhof Institute and who's interested in the topic. Our job today, what our task is to talk about the issue. What I've asked the board members to do is to be ready in some way to respond formally or informally to the topic itself. And let me see if I can set some parameters here. First of all, when we say red lines, what we mean by that is, what constitutes a red line is a firm or relatively stable moral or religious certainty upon which one can rely, upon which you as an individual or hopefully your community can base their ethical, religious, and for our purposes, halakhic reasoning. That is, this is something we know we're not going to transgress, right? That at bottom, this is who and what we are, what we stand for, a standard that we're not going to violate, and so forth. That is what we mean by red lines. Now, we're talking about this topic precisely because there is a sense, and we all share it, that what used to be red lines, what we all thought were the red lines for ourselves as individuals, and certainly for the communities to which we belong. And we belong to liberal, progressive, reform, Jewish religious communities. Those red lines have shifted and perhaps disappeared. So the question is, what has happened to those lines? And I think I just want to point out the three challenges that we have encountered to the very concept of a red line in talking about in our liberal or progressive context. The first reality that hits us is the reality of fact. That is, historically speaking, change has occurred in our lives. Any number of the red lines that used to exist for us in terms of ethics or law or religion or theology or halakha, standards of observance or practice have indeed changed. We have a sense that that solid and stable reality in these fields no longer exists, simply because we have experienced a great deal of change in reality, in fact. The second reality that hits us is the reality of theory. That is, when we start to think about red lines, we start to try to justify in some theoretical way the existence of red lines, we find it very difficult or impossible to do so when we're talking to anyone but ourselves. We normally blame this on postmodernism, okay, the intellectual climate of postmodernism, which casts doubt upon foundations of any sort in fields like ethics or halakha, that kind of thing. But it isn't just postmodernism. I mean, much of modernism, much of the stuff that's been happening in the world for the last 200 or 300 years has contributed to this this climate where red lines have disappeared. It was, after all, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels in the Communist Manifesto who authored that famous line, "All that is solid melts into air," which pretty much was talking about how the ethics, the customs, the mores of society that people used to count on have been shown to be evanescent. They do disappear when it comes, they blame this on economic changes and on economic realities. But the fact is that Way back in the 19th century, people were talking this way. You can throw Darwin into the mix, Einstein. You can throw the pragmatic movement in philosophy, and all kinds of other modernistic, that is, pre-postmodernistic movements, which challenge the very idea of red lines in theory. That is, you want to say that there's a standard that is solid and firm. Go ahead, try to justify it. I'll show you that you can't. And that's pretty much where we are theoretically. And then finally, the third thing that's happened is, well, we used to perhaps be able to count on our community of interpretation, our community of argument for red lines. Well, maybe there are no red lines that are universally valid, that all of us in our modern Western environment can share, but certainly within our particular ethical communities, or halakhically speaking, within our particular progressive or liberal religious halachic communities, there are certain things we all hold in common to be true, and in the language of the Declaration of Independence, self-evident. And yet we have a sense that even within our own communities, the red lines seem to have disappeared, certainly are being called into question. So there you go. The problem, one could say, well, so what? This is the way life is. But we could respond to that and say, yes, but in the absence of firm standards, of red lines, starting points that we can count on, how do we even do our ethical, moral, religious, or halachic reasoning or argumentation? If I'm going to make an argument for anything, I have to be able to count on something as a basis for that. And if there's nothing, if I'm looking down at my foundation and find that there's nothing there, I'm just dangling in the air. How do I conduct an argument that has any substance to it? I mean, that's kind of where we are. And so what I want to do is ask members of our board to respond to this issue in their own way. And let's do this alphabetically, which is useful because I get to go last then. So I'm going to start with Rabbi Joan Friedman, who is also chair of the responsive committee of the CCAR. Just, Joan, how do you respond to the topic that we're talking about today?
I have to say that I did not prepare a response. It's a wonderful question, but I personally am increasingly the truly unprecedented concern that concerns me is the near reality of climate change and its consequences. And this is really the only. I don't understand why people are not more panicked. And the only reason I can find for that is that it is so overwhelming that people don't know how to respond, and so I find myself moving to a way of thinking that increasingly says that there is only one standard, one fundamental standard for guiding and evaluating human activity, and that is, does it contribute to preserving the diversity of life on this planet, or does it not? And I have been thinking about this a lot, but I haven't had time to develop it at all because there are so many other issues that are, demanding of our time and attention. But broadly speaking, I feel like this is a time of crisis to which we have not yet begun to respond adequately. out of a Torah response. So.
Thank you. I mean, but let me just throw in something, hopefully very briefly, that yes, we're in a crisis, but what happens when so many of the people that we need to mobilize to address that crisis do not agree on the standards by which to measure crises? In other words, when you hear people say, I don't believe in climate change, well, what does that even mean? Do you not listen to science? Well, we've just been through a pandemic. We've seen a lot of people don't have time to listen to not just to individual scientists, but to science as a whole, the authority of science, which used to be a red line, at least we thought in our red. Yeah. So yeah, that's a case where the disappearance of red lines really does not serve us well if we happen to be one of those who believes in the climate crisis. Rabbi Audrey Korotkin, do you have a response to any of the kinds of things we're throwing out today?
Well, I think for me, the issue of the red lines is very social political. Because I live in a small community that is generally very politically conservative. And while most of my folks are more liberal, I find that I have this increasing gulf between me and the conversations that are going on in our movement within our Reform rabbinate, that to me, like it's red lights, not just red lines. So there are either some presumptions among colleagues. The thing that came up recently, which we know we've been struggling with in the Responsa committee, but also broadly within the Reform rabbinate, is a couple of our colleagues for their personal reasons, kind of demanding vociferously that we acknowledge polyamory as something that is not a red line anymore and should be normalized. And it bothers. This is just not, I was kind of taken aback by it. And then we had several colleagues who, again, are in personal circumstances that they basically want us to give a hecture to. And that really bothers me for a couple of reasons. One is that I think, as has happened in the past, they're trying to link it to, well, you said yes to this, so you have to say yes to this. You said yes to gay marriage, so you have to say yes to interfaith marriage. You said yes to gay marriage, so you have to say yes to polyamory, as though those things are comparable. It's kind of like the bastardization of intersectionality that's being used politically now, that's not what intersectionality is, but it's being used to say, my struggle is your struggle, and therefore they are equivalent. And there's no difference between them. And I find this difficult for a couple of reasons. One is that I don't think their reasoning is accurate, but two, because I get this sense that these are rabbis who are not considering, never mind halakhah or reasoning or anything like that. It's like, what I want in my life and what I'm going to be putting out there should be the standard and the norm for my community and for everybody else's community. And I should be able to tell you how to talk to people. I had a question about dealing with sexual issues and Leviticus that I was going to be talking with a church group about. And I was basically told, well, you really can't do that because you're not queer. you need to find somebody who is a queer rabbi to have that conversation. I just find when you talk about postmodernism, it's to me, it's moving from a liberalism toward, I want to say, an illiberalism, but I find it very selfish and very sort of me-centered. And it's very difficult to have conversation with somebody who really not only doesn't have a sense of where my more conservative community comes from, but doesn't really care. And the sense that community doesn't matter, or, you know, every community, we talk about the Middle Ages and communities creating their own takanot for their own needs, but I'm being asked or told to say that somebody else's essentially standard for a takana has to apply to my community as well. And I find that very problematic and not very collegial.
Yeah, thank you. I would just, the issue of polyamory really does highlight the problem, the problem that we're talking about. Without red lines, how do you say no to any individual choice? On what basis could you possibly say no? I mean, that's a question. Rabbi Rick Rheins, Denver, Colorado.
Thank you, Rabbi. Listen, your preamble was wonderful in that it described Marx, Engels, and their consideration of the freedom for humanity, a macro vision of what are red lines, what are the ethics, what are the mores that would apply to all of humanity. And we're not there at all. We're looking at our group. A group gets to define itself. A group gets to describe what it is to be a part of that group. We start with what it means to be a Jew. Not anyone who just says, I am a Jew, is a Jew, unless the community, which defines itself, will accept you as a Jew. That's why we have a Beit Din. That's why we have a group that will confirm that this person has met all of the standards that we have, in which we will accept and acknowledge that person as being a part of the group. Now we get to the point of what does it mean to be a progressive Jew? What it means to be a part of Reform Judaism. Certainly, if you're Haredi or Chabad or conservative or Orthodox, they will have their standards of what it means to be a part of their community. Reform Judaism does as well. We have kept congregations out, saying, you wish to be a humanistic congregation to deny that there is God. You're right, but you do not belong to this group that we have defined as Reform Progressive Judaism. And that's okay. We're not saying you're bad people. We're not making a judgment on you, but you don't belong to our group. So as long as we are in the acceptance that Progressive Judaism, as expressed through the Freehoff Institute, is a part of Reform Judaism, Progressive Judaism, and we take these issues seriously, we can very much establish what it means to be Reform and Progressive. And I wanted to put out another, I think Joan's idea of environmentalism is very, very important. And certainly, and Audrey, I think what you were expressing with some of the issues specifically with polyamorous relations, that is a great example. But there's a bigger picture I'd like us to look at as well. And that is, what does it mean to be a Reform Jew vis-a-vis other branches of Judaism, A, and B, what does it mean to be a Reform American Jew, Western Jew, vis-a-vis the growing weight of significance of the Jewish community in Israel and the diminishing significance of Judaism in Chutz La'aretz. And we have to acknowledge that our Israeli brothers and sisters are no longer depending on us for their well-being and for their support. Yes, I go to Washington and I lobby for with AIPAC and for all of the funds and the military support, but they're not begging for us. My wonderful Israeli friends like to point out, it used to be that Reformed congregations with great sincerity would send to communities boxes of old socks and underwear, saying, our poor Israeli cousins, here are slightly used, gently used socks. You don't have to send a thank you note, but that would be nice too, or a plaque. They don't need that anymore. They're doing pretty darn well. And in fact, most Jews in the world now are living there. But what does it mean to be a Jew chutz la'aretz? What will it mean to be a Jew in a diminishing, difficult community, even in the United States, with all of our advantages, with all of our wealth, facing growing anti-Semitism, growing ambivalence as to what it even means to be Jewish or to be religious whatsoever? We have to also act on behalf of our own preservation. If we're considering what it means to be a Jew who doesn't live in Israel, but we want to be accepted by and acknowledged by our brothers and sisters who are there, we have to take ourselves seriously. And not to say that everything goes is a part of our group. We define ourselves to strengthen ourselves for our own preservation and for our own relevance to other Jews around the world.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Rick. You raised a lot of issues that I hope we come back to. I just made a mental note to myself. I think I'd like some of my socks back on the, if that's the way they feel, okay. And I miss those socks. Anyway, Rabbi Amy Scheinerman.
I did not prepare anything in advance, but I expressed some skepticism about this topic when you first put it out. I'm wary of setting ab initio red lines before any discussion has taken place and people have had a chance to express their views and concerns and exchange their reasoning for those views. Audrey, I took note that you talked about individuals seeking confirmation of personal choices as selfish. And I can certainly understand that view. And what went through my brain is that once there was a time when women who wanted to control their own reproduction and pursue careers and even become rabbis were told they were selfish. And ideas do change, as Mark, you put so well. And that's another reason that I don't want to, from the beginning, exclude things from the realm of conversation. I don't see in the liberal world that Halakhah is a set of rules and regs for how to be a Jew. I see it as a process for engaging in Jewish thinking and study and exploration of what is the best path for us to take as Jews. And I think if we have the fullness of that discussion, as uncomfortable as it will undoubtedly be at times, as strange as the topics may sound to us, and however much some things may offend certain members of the community, the proper boundaries will emerge out of the conversation. And I don't feel they need to be announced up front and stifle the conversation.
Thank you, Amy. Very, very well put. All of you have expressed different aspects of this issue, the the difficulty of finding red lines, and yet in some cases, the necessity of them. But then how do you go about identifying them? When I thought about the topic, and I've been engaged in the work of progressive Halakhah for some decades now, where one is, asked a question: what is the best answer? What is the best response to make to this particular issue? Always in the background, this question of red lines is always in the background. Let me just give you. I want to start out by giving you an example, just thinking about how I personally make decisions in my own life about matters, serious matters of ethical or religious import or halakhic import. That is, without talking to anybody else, but or maybe to my spouse, because if it's a household thing. But the way I make these decisions, I find that if it's a serious or interesting question, there's going to be more than one plausible answer. That is, yes or no might be legitimately plausible answers to a question, or do it this way, do it that way. And my goal in making the decision is to come up with some way in which I can determine that A is a better answer than B, or vice versa. So I have some sort of scale of priorities that is operating in the background that allows me to measure this choice versus that choice. I don't usually think, when I'm doing this reasoning on my own, I don't usually think about red lines. But if I push my decision-making toward that end, if I actually step back and think about, well, wait a minute, on what am I really basing this decision? I generally find that there is an option that might be plausible, but that I am simply not considering. That is, it's there, that answer is out there somewhere, but I'm just not going to go there. Why I'm not going to go there has to do with everything, my beliefs, my preferences, my background, my outlook, and so forth. But there's going to be at least one possible response, one, presumably reasonable response to the question that I will not take, simply because that's not on the table for me. And in that instance, that thing that I don't do serves as my red line. It doesn't answer the question for me. Recognizing that's what I won't do does not answer the question, what should I do? But it occurs to me that knowing what I won't do, knowing where the red line is, makes it possible for me to distinguish between the acceptable answers. That I do have a scale of priorities, and the scale of priorities of necessity is going to rule certain things out. So if I work out my choice to the nth degree like that, I will recognize there are some red lines that I'm not crossing. Doesn't mean that tomorrow those red lines will be in the same place, so that 10 years from now they'll be in the same place. Things have changed, as everybody has pointed out. But right now, in this moment, there are functioning red lines that make it possible for me to do this reasoning. Now, the second step is to take this on a more communal level, I guess. How do we reason among ourselves? Well, my favorite example, because I was on the responsive committee for so long, would be the reform responsive process. What do? We Reform rabbis, we very liberal, progressive, tolerant kinds of people, not wanting to rule things out, not wanting to be so machmir about stuff. How do we end up determining the best answer out of a multiplicity of possible answers? I'm thinking, and I just wanted to choose one responsum out of all of them that we could pick, and I wanted one that was not necessarily on a hot button social issue, because that kind of thing will always raise problems. I'm thinking of the responsum called Pesach, Kashrut, and Reform Judaism. It's number 5756.9 if you're keeping score at home, or if you want to look that up later. It's a teshuvah that has to do with two broad topics. Number one, what about kitniot, the Isur kitniot during Pesach? And there was that section. But I'm going to focus on the second section, which has to do with the Isur of the possession of chametz, bal yira'eh, val yimatzeh, it's called, right? The requirement to get rid of your chametz, the positive mitzvah, it's a negative mitzvah. It's also a mitzvah aseh of bi'ur chametz, tashbitu, it says in the Torah, you got to get rid of it. Okay, so that's interesting. And it turns out that there are several ways in the halachic tradition in which this mitzvah is observed. One way is through actual destruction of the chametz that is in your possession. You have to destroy it by noontime thereabouts on the 14th of Nisan. Bi'ur chametz taken very literally. You burn it, you flush it down the toilet, or you give it away. Giving it to the poor, a great idea, in liberal circles, and kind of unites our ritual and social action approaches. But getting rid of the stuff so that it is physically no longer there. The second means by which to get rid of chametz is through the sale, mechirat chametz, right? And this is done because people might possess large amounts of chametz, which it would be, financially. It would constitute a real financial burden to actually destroy all of this stuff. But you can arrange a sale. We think of it as a fictitious sale, but it's not. It's a legal sale. It's a sale that meets all the formal requirements of Jewish law. But we know, and the buyer, the non-Jewish buyer of this chametz, we both know that, at the end of Pesach, we are going to reacquire the chametz. So that's a second option. And the third option is something called bitul chametz, which actually goes back to Talmudic times. The idea that if I simply remove myself mentally, I declare my chametz hefker, which is what you do in the traditional bi'ur chametz ceremony. You go around, you find all the chametz the night before that you can, and then you recite the formula that's in the Haggadah right before the Seder starts. Any chametz that remains in the house, I declare to be null and void, that kind of thing. Well, it turns out you could do that theoretically with all of your chametz. I simply do not own this anymore. I declare it ownerless. If you are sincere about it, if you have no mental reservations, and if you're not worried that you might accidentally grab one of those cookies and eat them during Pesach, which means that you're not 100% on board with this, then this method of bitul chametz would work. The responsum talks about these three methods, and essentially it comes down on the side of bitul chametz. That is, that for Reform Jews who have a problem with the second option, the sale of chametz, because something about that may strike us as ethically problematic, selling something that I intend to reacquire. All right, we can do bitul. Now, in Orthodox Halakhah, that option is pretty much closed off because it's assumed that you can't really remove yourself from the ownership of your chametz, and therefore it is you got to do something safer. Actually, make a legal removal called sale, or just destroy all the chametz. All right, so the responsum makes the argument for bitul as opposed to mechira, as opposed to bi'ur, physical destruction. There's one thing that the responsum does not take up, one possibility that it does not raise, and that is to say that the whole issue of the possession of chametz, let alone the isur of actually eating chametz during Pesach, but we're talking about the possession here, is really no longer meaningful for Reform Jews. That is, come on, Jews have been selling chametz only to rebuy it for so long that let's call a spade and say that we don't really intend to get rid of this. So let's just make a straight line instead of wiggling all over the place and say that the Isur itself does not speak to us. It's not meaningful. And as a group of Reform rabbis, we can declare that this prohibition no longer is valid for us. That option is not mentioned in the Teshuvah. It might have been. That might have been an interesting discussion. But the Teshuvah approaches the issue based on the assumption that we're not going there. I mean, it doesn't say that explicitly, but implicitly, given that that option is always in front of us as Reformed Jews, it's what the Torah says, but I'm Reformed, I don't have to do that. The committee that wrote the responsum said, okay, these other three options are live options for us, but we're trying to make a decision based on the notion that this mitzvah in and of itself is meaningful to us. That's our red line. On this particular issue, a red line is operating, and it gives meaning and purpose to the other options that the respondent positively considers, that is, actively considers, in order to choose one as the best one, leaving open the possibility that people read the respondent might disagree. Okay. I guess the conclusion I draw from this is that in any example of halachic reasoning, and just as in any example of personal, ethical, or moral reasoning that any of us might do, red lines exist. They exist because it would be impossible for us to do this reasoning to get from point A to point B in the absence of those red lines. There are things we won't do, and we go from there whether we're explicit about it or not. The question then is, how do you take this into the larger community? Well, the purpose of writing a responsum, I think in a liberal context, is to get the argument out into the public. That is, I imagine that there is a community out there of individuals who are interested in what this text might have to say. The argument is meaningful to them. Perhaps they'll be persuaded, perhaps not. But every act of moral or ethical reasoning, whether we do it verbally, whether we do it in writing, whether it's a responsum, or whether it's something else, is really an invitation to our conversation partners to look at this particular aspect of reality in the way that we're looking at it. We're not necessarily talking about grandiose red lines that we have to agree upon in advance. I agree there with Amy. I agree with Rick that we need some. I agree with Amy that I don't know how the hell we're going to come up with them. And so I'm not sure that discussion on that level is a fruitful one, because it's gonna run aground very quickly. But on I guess in a more practical sense, the questions that we actually think about and argue about involve cases of bottom-up versus top-down reasoning. I don't have to come up with my red line before I do the argument. I make the argument, try to come up with this option versus that option. And if, in doing so, I recognize where the red line is. If the community of readership, those who consume this argumentation, happen to agree, then there's something we know that we share. And over time, that's how we work out our red lines. So, do red lines exist? Yes. Are they necessary? Absolutely. Can I impose them on anybody else? Hell no. But I think the people I end up talking to, when I'm not talking to myself, are people who also understand that there are red lines. And the question is, do we come together on this particular line? And if we do, if the argument between us makes sense at all, chances are we do come together in some way on the existence of that particular red line. Okay, yeah, Joan, at this point.
First of all, that was brilliant, and I want to continue with it. But I
All
have
right.
to get to another meeting right now. So
All right.
I will watch the rest of this by videotape. Like Warner Wolf, we'll go to the videotape and watch it
Yeah.
way back when. And so thank you so very much. And I hope that you'll schedule soon a follow-up to this as well, because this is terrific. But please forgive me for having to bow out. I've got a congregation I got to take care
Yeah.
of.
I mean, some people have actually. Rick, okay, take care, and we'll see you. All right. So Joan, I think you raised a hand. By the way, your student who came in and was on camera has now been immortalized as part of the Freehoff Institute archives. And that I'm sure she will appreciate that for many years to come. Okay, so anyway,
Sure.
yeah.
Sorry. So, so here's what makes this, I think, so difficult, right? Because I think it's much easier, essentially, to set a red line for something like, okay, chametz, right? Chametz, and I hate to fall back on these categories, but I don't know, I don't know what else is. Rituals, Kaufman Kohler was wrong, right? There is no, like original essence of ritual that we can no longer reinterpret. I mean, rituals can be endlessly reinterpreted, and they are essentially, in some ways, they are vessels into which we pour meaning, and probably the origins of not having chametz on Pesach are not something that we would necessarily relate to now, but it doesn't really matter, right? Because we have built up a whole community of meaning based on that. And if what was meaningful to somebody, in the 5th century BCE, didn't, so, it's easy to maintain a continuity of action and add new meanings. But we've already long ago, as a movement, because we are part, we are time bound in a sense. We are a movement that came about because of quote unquote modernity. We have all of these. Other parts of Torah that serve to regulate society that we recognize as having been determined by social mores and assumptions of that day, right? And the easiest one to point to is the treatment of women and the status of women, right? So this is a whole other, it's a whole other order of magnitude in terms of setting red lines, because once we've already said that things in Torah themselves are the result of social constructs, then we've opened, and I'm really conscious of this, because frankly, I'm really self-conscious about not opening myself up to charges of hypocrisy, having argued since the 1990s that it is okay to recognize same-sex relationships. But there are a whole other set of grounds on which I have very serious reservations about this whole business of polyamory. And did everybody see the piece in the Times about some cities where this is beginning, right? So this, it's a really complex and problematic issue. So it's not just red lines because it's in the Torah. It's also where are our red lines, in the course of shifts in social values, right? And that's what makes it so difficult.
Micah.
Yeah, I appreciate everything that's been said here. When I logged on, I didn't know what conversation exactly I was logging in for, but this is really interesting. And Joan, you just used a word that I find to be a really important word, which is the word meaningful. We perform rituals because they are meaningful. And one of the charges that often gets leveled at liberal Judaism, or that I hear because I spend too much time on Twitter, is this idea that you're bringing your liberal values to Judaism. Why don't you find some Jewish values? Why don't you read the Torah and find some Jewish values instead of your liberal values? And I think what we recognize, because we are liberal Jews, is that actually everybody ever in the history of Judaism and every other tradition in the world has brought their own values to the reading of text. It's impossible not to, just by virtue of being human beings who read texts. We read them through the lens of our own values. And so when we say, in some ways, we have codified this idea in a way that maybe others didn't. When the Pittsburgh platform says that we perform such rituals as are, what is it saying, edifying and elevating or something like that. Well, we said it out loud, but we're not prescribing that, we're describing that. That's what Jews have always done. We perform rituals because they are meaningful, and we constantly reframe issues in ways that make them meaningful in the generation in which we're living. The Torah is the record of all the ways that we've reframed everything about Judaism since the beginning of Judaism. And so when I think about an issue like, polyamory issue, or like, Pesach and, eating chametz on Pesach, I think to myself, the fact that we perform rituals and make Jewish decisions because they are meaningful actually means that we are participating in this eternal progressive halachic discussion that's been going on for so long. And so, Mark, when you were describing the tshuva, I wondered, what is the harm of a tshuva like that, saying something like, another option we have is to consider that this ritual is no longer meaningful to us, and there'd be some grander, more halachic, better language that you'd come up with for that rather than what I said. But I think maybe, I don't want to say there are no red lines in liberal Judaism. I think, there are certain values that we learn, that we bring to our reading of the text, and that are present in the text. Murder's wrong no matter what. There's a red line there. But also we believe very deeply in autonomy. And so to a certain extent, I think we are constantly balancing the commitment to community and communal standards with the commitment to autonomy. And when it comes to something like a polyamorous relationship, I don't know anything about that, but I'm learning more. I think the question is not, can I impose a red line or standard on someone else's practice, but rather, in a world where Judaism is built on autonomy, how can leaders provide framing in which people can make their individual decisions based on Jewish values? And then how can we be a community together? And then, rabbis have to make their decisions about whether they're going to officiate. But to me, I think if autonomy is important to us, which it is, then the question of how can we be a community is possibly a more important question than where are the red lines?
Well, yeah, and maybe one of the red lines is the fact that we exist in this tension between autonomy and community. That is a description of liberal or progressive Judaism that probably is not going to change, because on the one hand, I can make whatever decisions I want. On the other hand, most of the serious Jews I know of a liberal persuasion agree that our choices need to be Jewishly meaningful, and the way you measure that is to come into some sort of conversation with the texts. When you asked a question about that responsum, could a responsum simply set out all the options, including, and it's equally valid not to do this at all? One could answer, well, one of our red lines is that, when you're asking a question in the form of you're asking a she'elah, looking for a teshuvah, the function of this particular piece of writing is to say, we think, if it's an individual, we as a group, we think this particular option is the better one, and here's why. Part and parcel of the process of argument is to take a stand. At some point, you have to decide which you prefer, and then try to get the community to come along if it's a question of communal standards. That is, if I want to belong to a community that finds meaning in doing this thing. Yes, red lines with respect to social issues, things like personal relationships, sexual identity, the kinds of cultural questions that we have seen, where we've seen a great deal of shifting in our lifetimes, let alone over the past 200 or 300 years, very difficult to set simply because we know that they have changed. But just a couple of things, and we're going to have to bring this to a conclusion. Just a couple of points that I want to make without trying to identify any particular red lines, because that's where it gets really difficult. But number one, the fact that things have always changed, or the fact that something may change tomorrow, does not absolve me today of the obligation to make decisions. Unless I'm totally neutral on the question, unless I really have no opinion, or it's not important to me to make a decision, I have to figure out what I'm going to do now. I know things can change, but to abstain from making decisions on the grounds that things might change in the future renders me impotent from a moral and ethical standpoint. I can't do anything now because I'm measuring against the possibility that things will change. Similarly, if I look in the past, things have changed a great deal, right? Things have changed the last 10, 20, 50, 100 years. Therefore, what? Well, that's an example of what David Hume, I think, called the inductive fallacy, right? The fact that something keeps happening does not mean necessarily, logically, that it will continue to happen. Practically speaking, yeah, it probably will continue to happen. If the sun came up yesterday and the day before that, it'll probably come up tomorrow, and it's a safe bet that it will, but it does not mean that it will, which means that we are free today to make decisions about anything, any kind of question that arises for us on the basis of some commitment to religious or ethical truth. Let's call it progressive halakhah. We talk about it as a process, but eventually you have to make decisions, and we're free to make those decisions as long as we recognize that our decisions are different than the ones that were made before. And they might very well be different than the ones that will be made in the not too distant future. Our red lines, and I do think they exist, are a work in progress. They always are, which doesn't mean we do without them. It just means we have to approach the topic with the requisite humility, and not to say, now that I've come up with a red line, that's the way it's going to be tomorrow, because I can't guarantee that. There is a lot more that we could say, a lot to unpack here, but I kind of promised everybody that we would close at the end of the hour. I'd like those of you on the screen, I'm going to stop the recording in just a moment. I'd like those of you who are on the screen to stick around just for like 2 seconds. We have a little business to take care of. In the meantime, this has been the Freehoff Institute of Progressive Halakhah discussion of Is Nothing Sacred? Red Lines and Progressive Halakhah. I think we opened the discussion today. We may come back to it in the future. There's a lot more to say about it, but hopefully this has got us all thinking. Thanks so much for those of you who participated. And for those of you watching this, wherever and whenever you are, thank you as well.